Okay, we were discussing the fact that in two places the Torah has a juxtaposition between Shabbos and Mishkan. One is in Kisisa when Hashem is speaking to Moshe, and the other is in Vayakel when Moshe is speaking to Bnei Yisrael. According to Rashi, the message is exactly the same, that even though there's a mitzvah to build a Mishkan, but you do not violate Shabbos by building a Mishkan. Rashi says both in Kisisa and in Vayakel. Rashi gives the exact same explanation. The kasha is that why is the order reversed? In Kisisa, the reference to Shabbos, V'shomru v'nei Yisrael Shabbos, only comes after the tzivoy of Mishkan, when Moshe gives the message to Bnei Yisrael, he's makdim Shabbos to Mishkan. If the message is the same, that Melechas HaMishkan is not Docha Shabbos, you cannot violate Shabbos to build a Mishkan, why is the order going to be different? So because of this does not answer Rashi, but the Meshech Chochmah has a whole very interesting chiddush. And the Meshech Chochmah points out that when Hashem is speaking to Moshe in Parshas Truma, Tetzaveh, Kisisa, that is before the Chet Egel. That's in the first 40 days before the Chet Egel. By the time Moshe is speaking to Bnei Yisrael, that's after the Chet Egel, after he came down with the second Luchos on Yom Kippur. So says the Meshech Chochmah that before the Chet Egel, now this is theoretical because we never got the Torah without the Chet Egel. I mean, we got the Ten Commandments. But Moshe, when he came down with the Luchos, he broke the Luchos. So it's all theoretical. But theoretically, the Meshech Chochmah says, had there not have been a Chet Egel, we would have been permitted to build a Mishkan even on Shabbos. So the reason why Mishkan is before Shabbos, when Hashem speaks to Moshe, is under the original scheme of things, Mishkan would be more important than Shabbos, and Mishkan would have been Docha Shabbos. It's only after the Chet Egel that things got different, and Moshe says Shabbos is more important than Mishkan. So that's how he's medayek it. We'll explain the reason for this. But the chiddush of the Meshech Chochmah is, had there not been a Chet Egel, Melechas HaMishkan would have been Docha Shabbos. And that's why Mishkan is prior to Shabbos. Now, without even getting into the explanation, which I'll get into in a moment, I just want to point out why Rashi himself could not have given that answer. Why Rashi behechrich learns that both references are the same. Let me remind you, I think we talked about this, that although the tzivuyim about building a Mishkan are written in the Torah before the Chet Egel, in fact, Rashi applies the rule of ein muktam u'ma'ucher b'Torah. The Torah does not always follow chronological order, meaning, this is an amazing thing. According to Rashi, all of the tzivoyim that Hashem gives to Moshe about the Mishkan are the second time that he goes up, actually it's the third time, but the second Luchos, and in the first Mem Yom there would not have been a Melechas HaMishkan. Now, again, I'll explain why that is so again, but the point is, if according to Rashi, all references to Mishkan are post-Chet Egel, then you can't say that had there not been a Chet Egel, Mishkan would have been Docha Shabbos. Had there not been a Chet Egel, there wouldn't have been a Mishkan to begin with. So that's why Rashi has to learn the significance of the juxtaposition is the same both in Parshas Kisisa and in Parshas Vayakel. But the Meshech Chochmah is going with the Ramban's sheet. The Ramban doesn't like, right? The Ramban cannot reject the rule of ein muktam u'ma'ucher b'Torah, that the Torah does not always follow chronological sequence. The Ramban does not totally reject it because, number one, Chazal say it, so the Ramban cannot argue with Chazal. And number two, there are absolutely places in the Torah where you must say 100% that the Torah is not following chronological order. So the Ramban does not deny the rule, but I think it's fair to say the Ramban does not like this rule, and whenever possible, the Ramban is mafaresh the psukim to refer to a chronological ordering. And therefore, if Hashem tells Moshe about the Mishkan, and it's written in the Torah before the Chet HaEgel, we assume that indeed Hashem gave the mitzvah before the Chet HaEgel. With the Ramban, the Meshech Chochmah then could be Mechadesh, that had there not been a Chet HaEgel, the Mishkan would have been Deicha Shabbos. Now this is an interesting point, because we normally assume that the Torah would have been constant, that what Moshe got the first time is exactly what he got the second time. But the Meshech Chochmah is telling us that's not always true. There was an actual hypothetical Torah that may have differed in some particulars had there not been a Chet HaEgel, that had to get readjusted and reformulated because there was a Chet HaEgel. Now, what would the svara be? Meaning, why would it be the case that a Mishkan, the building of the Mishkan, would have overridden the Melechos of Shabbos had there not been a Chet HaEgel? So the Meshech Chochmah says, and again, this is clearly going with the Ramban, that Mishkan would have existed even before the Chet HaEgel. And the Meshech Chochmah says that the function of Mishkan in a pre-Chet HaEgel world is different than the function of Mishkan in a post-Chet HaEgel world. In a pre-Chet HaEgel world, you didn't need the Mishkan as a condition to bringing a korban to God. Without the Chet HaEgel, we would have been so holy, we would have been so elevated, we would have been so sanctified, that really we could serve Hashem everywhere. Everywhere would have been the Beis HaMikdash. There would be no need for specific Kohanim. Every Jew would be a Kohen. There'd be no need for a specific point. In other words, you didn't need a Mishkan as a matir of korbanos. So what would the function of the Mishkan be? It itself would have been a korban, meaning I don't need it to enable me to bring korbanos, but the Mishkan itself would have been a korban to God. The same way, you bring a korban from animals, you can bring a korban from your building. Your building of the gold and the silver and the copper is a way of glorifying Hashem. In other words, the Mishkan is not a machshir. It is not an enabler for a korban. It is a korban mitzad itself. So now the Meshech Chochmah says, once you characterize Mishkan not as an enabler, but as a korban, then it'll stand to reason that it will override Shabbos. Why? Because korbanos themselves override Shabbos. On Shabbos we bring the korban tamid, we bring the korban musaf, we light the menorah. Avodah is deicha Shabbos. And since the Mishkan would be treated as a form of avodah, it would be deicha Shabbos. Now, once, however, we committed the sin of the ego, at that point there is a change, even though Hashem forgave us, but there's a change in our relationship with God. There's a certain distance. There's a certain separation. Hashem says, yes, you still can serve me, you can still connect to me, but it has to be a special place, a special way, special people. So at that point, the Mishkan gets redefined not as an avodah, but it gets redefined as a means to enable you to do an avodah. In the language of halacha, it would not be an actual mitzvah, it would be a hechsher mitzvah. Now, preliminaries are not docha Shabbos. Let me give you a modern example. Let's take a bris milah. If a baby is born on Shabbos, so next Shabbos is the 8th day, so we do a bris on Shabbos, even though doing a bris involves malacha, you're causing bleeding. But bris milah overrides Shabbos. The mitzvah of bris milah is so important that it overrides Shabbos. But that only applies to the bris milah itself. What about if the moel wants to drive? or they want to drive the baby, whatever it is. That's not Docha Shabbos, because driving to shul or driving to the home is not the mitzvah, it is only the hechsher mitzvah. A mitzvah might be so important that it overrides Shabbos. A hechsher mitzvah cannot override Shabbos. So the Meshech Chochmah's point is, the Mishkan in pre-Chet HaEgel would have had the status of a korban in and of itself and would override Shabbos. The Mishkan after the Chet HaEgel was a machshir. It was, in other words, because we didn't have the closeness to God, we needed a structure and a building to enable us to bring a korban. So it leaves the getter of Maaseh mitzvah, and it becomes hechsher mitzvah. And that's why in Vayakel, says the Meshech Chochmah, Shabbos is before Mishkan, as if to say Shabbos is more important. That yes, Avodah is Deicha Shabbos. Avodah is Deicha Shabbos. But the construction of the Mishkan is not. Now, the emes is, let me just say, I have a feeling that you might be asking what I want to raise. If not, I'll take your question. One might ask a question though. The Meshech Chochmah assumes that if the Mishkan itself has the status of a korban, excuse me, the Mishkan would be Deicha Shabbos. The problem is we talked about the idea that not every korban is, thank you, not every korban is Deicha Shabbos. It has to be a korban that has a definite zman. Like a tamid has to be brought every day, a musaf has to be brought on Shabbos. But something like a sin offering or a burnt offering, where the Torah does not say a specific day that it has to be brought, that's not Docha Shabbos, because you can do it later. In fact, even by bris, you have the same idea, by the way, to use the bris analogy. If Shabbos is the 8th day, you do the bris on Shabbos. But if the bris is being delayed for whatever reason, and it's Shabbos, and it's the 10th day or the 9th day, you cannot do a bris, a late bris, on Shabbos, because there's no difference if I do it day 9 or day 10, meaning to say there's no zman that's kavua here. So the question you might ask on the Meshech Chochmah is, okay, I understand that pre-Chet HaEgel, the Mishkan would have the status of a korban. But since the Torah does not assign a specific date for the building of the Mishkan, it just gives you a mitzvah to build it, then l'chayra, shouldn't it be like a korban she'ein kavua lo zman, and a korban she'ein kavua lo zman? It's not Docha Shabbos. So that's a bit of a kash, I think, on the Meshech Chochmah. Is that what you wanted to say?
It's a stronger version. I asked.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about for the tzibur, but.
Okay. Yeah. Well. The Mishkan would be a korban tzibur. That wouldn't be a problem because it's on behalf of Am Yisrael. So. No, but what I'm saying is that, people could bring their own korbanos, that's true, and that wouldn't be Docha Shabbos. But the point is, building the Mishkan is how Klal Yisrael is offering a korban to Hashem. Yeah, I don't mean to say the individual korbanos would be Docha Shabbos. That wouldn't be true. But the building of the Mishkan would be a korban sibur. My question is, it's not kavua lo zman. I'm asking it from the other end. Okay, so this is the Meshech Chochmah's very, very interesting chiddush. And as I say, this actually is very, very interesting beyond the particular context, because it suggests, and the Meshech Chochmah actually uses this in other places, that what the Torah would have been like without a Chet HaEgel is not the same as what the Torah actually became because of the Chet HaEgel. Well, obviously, the Chet HaEgel is a story that wouldn't have been there. I mean, I don't mean that. That's an obvious point. But it means the mitzvos themselves might have had a different configuration. Certain halachos might have been different. There is this hypothetical first version of the Torah. Now, I know that people will ask, well, what do you mean hypothetical first version of the Torah? The Torah existed 2,000 generations before the world was created. It was black fire on white fire. Obviously, the Torah was as we have it. So how can you talk about hypotheticals? So I'll give you two answers to that. Number one, it happens to be that God knows the future. So, yeah, God knew there would be a Cheder Egel, so the Torah in Shemayim was the nusach of post-Cheder Egel. In other words, the Meshech Chochmah is kind of articulating a theoretical construct that Hashem knew would never be the case. That's answer number one. Answer number two is that the primeval Torah in heaven, this is from the Vilna Gaon, was indeed the same letters of the Torah as we have it, but it was not broken up into words. It was an unbroken sequence of letters that reflects the divinity of Hashem's essence, and theoretically it could be divided into different types of words. We don't know exactly how that would have worked, so had there not been a Cheder Egel, those same letters could have spelled a different type of message. Because of the Cheder Egel, it spells the message that we have it. So the primeval Torah in Shemayim is lav dafka, the words and sentences that we have, although it is the letters that we have. Where does the Gemara say this, just as an aside? The Gemara says this to be masber a Gemara in Bava Basra. The Gemara in Bava Basra discusses who wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. Now, we know that Hashem dictated everything to Moshe Rabbeinu and he wrote it down. Who wrote the last 8 verses? Why is there a problem about the last 8 verses? Because the last 8 verses discuss Moshe Rabbeinu's death. Did Moshe write the words, Vayamas Moshe? I mean, did he write something that was a lie at the time? It wasn't true. So there's a machlokas. According to one man Amar, the last 8 verses were not written by Moshe Rabbeinu at all. They were written by Yehoshua ben Nun. Amazing. So even though the Rambam seems to say that one of the 13 principles of faith is that every letter of the Torah was inscribed by Moshe Rabbeinu, al pi Hashem, there is clearly a man Amar in the Gemara that says the last 8 verses were written by Yehoshua ben Nun. Now, please be sure you understand, that doesn't mean he made it up. It was also al pi Hashem. Hashem told him what to write, but they were not written till Moshe Rabbeinu died. Presumably on Zion Adar itself, on the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died, Hashem dictated to Yoshua to write these words. That's one man Amar. The other man Amar says, Moshe wrote everything, but he wrote the last 8 verses bidema. Bidema means in tears. What's the point in tears? So the simple meaning is that he's writing about his death. So he's crying. But if that's the pshat, it's a little superfluous. Like why are we told what his emotional state was? The main point was, did he write it or didn't he write it? So because of this, the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, has a very unique interpretation of what the word dema means. Dema does not mean tears. Dema means a jumble or a mixture. A totally unrelated word. You see in the Mishnah, for example, when truma falls into chulin, and therefore if you're a non-Kohen, you can't eat it unless you have 100 parts of chulin to the truma. So the term for a chulin truma mixture is dimua. Dimua means mixture. So this phrase that Moshe wrote the last 8 verses, bidema, according to the Gra, is not translated. He wrote it in tears, but he wrote it as a jumble. What's the pshat? Because we have a dilemma here. On one hand, we believe, this man Amar believes, every letter of the Torah has to be written by Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the way Hashem set it up. On the other hand, we also believe every letter of the Torah must be true at all times. In other words, you can't have anything in the Torah that was a lie even momentarily. So the kasha is, how do you do both things? If Moshe doesn't write that he died and you leave it to Yoshua, you're violating the principle that every letter of the Torah has to be written by Moshe. But if you're going to tell me Moshe wrote Vayomas Moshe, you're violating the principle that every letter of the Torah must be true, because at the moment he wrote the words Vayomas Moshe, it was a sheker. Yeah, it'll become true in an hour. That's fine. But it was a lie when he wrote it. So how do you reconcile this contradiction? Says the Vilna Gaon, the contradiction is reconciled by Moshe inscribing the letters the way they appeared in the original Sefer Torah of Hashem in Shamayim. So Moshe did not write two words, Vayomas Moshe. Moshe wrote Vav, Yud, Mem, Saf, Mem, Shin, Hey, unbroken letters. I mean, the rest of the Torah was not. The rest of the Torah was words. Moshe wrote an unbroken sequence of letters, which did not become divided into the words Vayomas Moshe till Moshe died. Now, it could be that it got divided miraculously. It could be as soon as Moshe died, those letters split up into words, meaning, according to this Mandi Amar, Yoshua had nothing to do with it. Okay? And that's how the Gemara understands Dimua, or Dema, is the lashon of Dimua. So I'm bringing in this Gemara because I think it fits the Meshech Chochmah's idea that theoretically, even though the Torah was eternal and it predated the creation of the world, theoretically, the mitzvos might have assumed a different form depending on whether we sin with the golden calf or not. That just would have meant that the letters would have been divided into different sequences. They would have spelled out different words, perhaps even rearranged, although I'm not sure that would have been possible. So in terms of how could the Torah have assumed a different form, one answer is Hashem knew the future, and Hashem wrote the Torah based on what did happen or what will happen, even though theoretically something else could have happened. Or alternatively, the eternity of the Torah is a function of the letters, which have a great mystical meaning. I mean, the Ramban writes in the Hakdama to the Torah that all of the letters of the Torah spell out the name of God. We know Hashem has a 4-letter name of God, and Hashem has a 5-letter name of God. And then there's a 42-letter name of Hashem and a 72-letter name of Hashem, which we don't really know. But the Ramban says there is a 300 and plus thousand letter name of Hashem, which are the letters in the Torah. They represent the essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in those letters. Even before they're divided into words, even when you don't have a sentence, you don't have a word, you don't have a thought, it represents the divine energy that sustains the universe. That is why the Ramban says, if a Sefer Torah is missing a letter, the Sefer Torah is puzzle, even if the missing letter does not change the meaning of a word. Right? A lot of times a word might have a yud or might have an extra vav. So, if you don't have the letter, it doesn't change anything. But so what, the Ramban says? You no longer have the totality of the Shem Hashem. The Torah no longer conveys that divine energy. By the way, another ha'ara, the Ramban's statement, as beautiful as it is, actually appears not to be halacha l'maisa. The Ramah actually says that Bisman Hazeh, the Gemara, it's actually based on the Gemara in Kedushin. The Gemara in Kedushin talks about chaseros v'yaseros. Chaseros v'yaseros are words that miss a letter, or yaseros, or that have an extra letter, but it commonly does not change the meaning of the word, like Aharon. Aharon is sometimes with a vav, and sometimes without a vav. So without a vav, it's chaser. With a vav, it's malay. or Yeseris is another word for Malay. Sukkos is the same thing. Sukkos is plural, but sometimes it's with a vav, sometimes without a vav. Mezuzos in Kriya Shema, sometimes without a vav. These are all called chaseros v'yaseros. So the Gemara in Kedushin says, this itself is pretty amazing, that Bizman Hazeh means in the time of the Gemara already. We're not exactly bucky in the correct spellings of words, and therefore we don't passel the Sefer Torah because it's missing something, because maybe our Sefer Torah is wrong, maybe putting it in is wrong, because we may have lost the Messiah. And the Minchas Chinuch is masbir that only applies to Chaseris and Yeseris that don't change meanings. Things that change meanings, for sure we're going to passel. And the Ramah, so paskins in Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah actually paskins, that because we are not Bekian in Chaseris v'Yeseris, if a Sefer Torah is missing a letter that does not change the meaning of the word, we do not take out another Sefer Torah. So it's interesting that the Ramban's famous assertion in his Hakdama to the Torah seems not to be that. I mean, the Ramban is a Rishon. The Ramban could be cholek on what the Ramah brings, but the halacha we don't pass like what the Ramban says. By the way, this Gemara in Kedushin, we're not bekian in Chaseris v'Yeseris, is actually one of the very strong arguments against the Bible codes. Again, I'm not here to attack the Bible codes or to endorse the Bible codes, but the Bible codes in some circles are very, very popular. That's the idea called equidistant letter spacing, meaning to say they'll take some parsha in the Torah that deals with a certain topic. Let's take Amalek, and by counting, how they figure out the patterns are kind of crazy, but they figure out some pattern. Every seventh letter, you'll spell out the name Hitler. No, Hey, and then Yud, etc. So Hitler is encoded in Amalek. And this is based on the notion of equidistant letter spacing. And by the way, they set it up also like an unbroken sequence of letters. Like the Gra says, the primeval Torah. Just letters, letters, letters. And they find patterns to different events. Some people even find, Trump and Biden. They do all sorts of different things here. Now, I don't want to, I certainly do not endorse it. I don't want to knock it either. The question is how much of it is random, how much of it is biased, how much of it is scientifically accurate. Could you do the same thing with War and Peace or the New York Times? And people have done different experiments where they could get patterns in anything. Also, the one big problem is this has never been used. Well, it's like, I think it was a Yogi Berra that said, you never know the future because it isn't here yet. See, what would have been amazing is if they could use this mechanism to predict an event that hasn't happened yet. The problem is you wouldn't know what you're looking for. That's the problem. So they have not been able, I don't even know if they've even tried because it's impossible. They have not been able to use this equidistant letter spacing to predict something that hasn't happened, but they've used it to encode events that have happened. So from the perspective of the Torah predicted Hitler in the Parsha of Amalek. But we're looking at it in retrospect. We're not looking at it as a future prediction. So there's a lot of problems here. And again, I don't want to endorse it. I'm not endorsing it. But one of the issues that I think is a very strong issue is that if you go with the Gemara in Kedushin, that we are not Bucky anymore in Chaseros or Yeseros, then the notion of equidistant letter spacing no longer works. Because how can you say there's a significance in every seventh letter if maybe there were some vavs that are missing or some yuds that are missing? So what you think is the seventh letter might actually be the 15th letter. How do you know? Because you don't have an authoritative text in that way that you can do it. Now, as the Minchas Chinuch says, When it comes to any halachic matter, nothing has been lost. Everything in the Torah is the same. There's been no loss of halachic knowledge. But the one thing that you have lost by definition, though, is number of letters and equidistant spacing. So one very interesting question is, how can Bible codes work if you're not baki b'chaseres v'yaseres? On the other hand, you have to go back to the Ramban. Maybe the Ramban doesn't accept the Gemara and Kedushin. I mean, the Ramban does say b'feirish that if the Torah misses any letter, the Torah is puzzle. So the Ramban apparently felt that we're not missing. I don't know how he's going to be miyash of the Gemara, I have to say, but we're not missing any letters. If we're not missing any letters, then indeed there might be a methodology that's possible. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's the problem with the Bible codes is that they retroactively predict events using the Torah. But
Yep.
Isn't that similar to what Chazal did with Purim and Hanukkah? They retroactively found ramazim for those chagim in the Torah.
Yeah, you are correct. I mean, the methodology of retroactively reading into the Torah predictions about events that didn't happen at that time, that is done by Chazal. Yeah, for sure. The only question is, what Chazal do is not necessarily what we can do. We don't have the insight. We don't have the Ruach HaKodesh.
What's the chiluk?
Well, the chiluk is, Chazal didn't just make things up. Either they had Masoros, traditions to that effect, or some element of Ruach HaKodesh. See, one thing is for sure. One thing I will tell you, and the Ramban himself writes this, he says, it is very, very clear that every event that will ever happen is alluded to in the Torah. So the fact that the Torah could allude to Hitler and allude to everything, that's theoretically 100% the case. The question is whether these specific associations work. But the Ramban says every single event in world history is merumaz in the Torah. In fact, the Vilna Gaon says every single event that will ever happen, every single mitzvah of the Torah, is alluded to in the first word, Bereshis. Bereshis, the beginning, contains everything. So I'll tell you a quick story. That somebody asked the Vilna Gaon, he says, everything is merumaz and Bereshis. Where is the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben? Rumaz and Bereshis. So the Vilna Gaon said, Pashut, it's a Rashi Teva. Bereshis. Ben Rishain, your first son, Achar Shloshim Yom, after 30 days, Tifta, you shall redeem. Bereshis is a Rashi Teva for the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben. Of course, those terutzim are shver, because then you'll just ask me, okay, where's Sittas, where's Tefillin? I don't know. I don't have an answer to anything else. We just have one word on one mitzvah, and the Gemara said it applies to all mitzvahs, but I have no teretz for how it applies to other mitzvahs. Now, the Ramban said, he didn't say Bereshis has everything, but he said Shiras Hazinu, which is Moshe's last song, contains everything that will happen to the Jewish people and everything that will happen to an individual in the Jewish people. So they have, again, a famous story that the Ramban had a Talmud, and the Talmud's name was Avner. And Avner went off the derech, so to speak. And Avner became an apikoros, and part of what Avner felt was, he ridiculed the Ramban. He said, what type of Baba Maisa that in this poem every future event is alluded to. So he said mockingly to the Ramban, he says, where is my life alluded to? Avner, where am I alluded to in Shiras Hazino? So the Ramban said right away, it was Mamash Ruach HaKodesh, that there's a pasuk in Hazino where Hashem is describing his disgust and anger with the Jewish people. And he said, at some point, I wanted to wipe them out and eradicate their memory from man. So the language of the pasuk is, Amarti, Hashem says, I said, Amarti Afeyem, I want to destroy them. Ashbisa me'enaish zichram, I will eradicate from humanity their memory. So says the Ramban, if you take the third letter of those words, they spell Avner. Af Ahem. Third letter is Aleph. Ash Bisa. Third letter is Beis. Nosh, third letter is Nun. Zichram, third letter is Resh. So yeah, Mr. Avner, you are encoded in Shiras Hazinu, because you are the one that God said, I would like to eradicate from the memory of man. So Avner was a little shaken up at this point. At this point, Avner was not as scoffing and mocking as he was. And the story goes that he went into isolation, he went into hiding, he left his family, he left his wealth, and he was chayzer b'tshuva, but he died tragically a very short time afterwards. So the thesis of the Bible codes is something that is largely true. The problem is the methodology. It's not the idea that the Torah predicts future events. Yeah.
Going back to there being an unbroken string and changing the spaces after the golden calf, would it then be possible, assuming that there's no rearranging, to reconstruct what the Torah would have said pre-golden calf?
Well, I think it's impossible. I mean, all we have is sporadic thoughts like the Meshech Chachma Melechas HaMishkan and the like. But even those things, keep in mind, are being inferred from the present text of the Torah, meaning it's not that we have an original text of the Torah. Rather, the fact that in the text we have, in the pre-Chet HaEgel Parshios, Mishkan is mentioned before Shabbos, we infer what would have been. In other words, you're asking for something that's much more than we have. We are not able to reconstruct. But sometimes there'll be hints in the present version of the Torah what the original version of the Torah would have provided.
But we still have all of the same letters in order.
That's correct. So you could actually work with different all the different ways of breaking them up.
Would it theoretically be possible to use a supercomputer or something?
Well, with AI, who knows what you can do? AI, the chat things, just say, divide up this parsha in all the different ways. Who knows what's going to be? But it might be possible. It might be possible. It reminds me of Lahavdil, because around maybe 25 years ago or more. So Chabad had the first draft of Tanya. And the Alter Rebbe revised it, and this first draft was never published. So there was a big discussion in Chabad, should we publish the first draft? Because on one hand, if the Alter Rebbe didn't distribute it, and he rewrote it, then what he wanted people to learn from was the second draft. So why are you publishing the first draft? On the other hand, they said that from the first draft, you could understand his kavanah more. So Lamaisa, they do publish the first draft, the Madura Kama. And they did the same thing with Mesilas Yesharim, by the way. Ramchal, same thing. Mesilas Yesharim was originally written in a very different format. Mesilas Yesharim was written as a dialogue and a debate between like a Talmid Chacham and a Baal Musar, in which the Talmid Chacham would say, the most important thing is learning, why are you bothering me with Midos and everything else? And it was structured as a debate going back and forth. And the Ramchal often wrote Sfarim that way. Other Sfarim are written that way as well. But then the Ramchal decided to write it differently as a straightforward hadracha of Musar. But too, in recent years, they've published both editions. So you can study the original edition, which is dialogue, and the revised edition. So as great as the Ramchal and the Baal Tanya are, they're not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in a way, this notion of looking at the first draft is very intriguing, but I think it would be extremely, extremely difficult to do, to find the Madura Kama of the Torah itself.
So actually, I think there's at least like 50 volumes, right? So the number of possible ways would be at least 2 to the 50, which is more than the atoms in the universe. So.
All right. Yeah, right. You'd need you're right. You would need a supercomputer of the kochos of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, which you're not going to find. Okay, but now the final. Maybe I'll continue tomorrow. The Meshech Chacham will then. I'll go over this tomorrow. Offers a gewaldige diuk. I'll just tell you what the diuk is, but I'm not going to explain it yet. And that is in Parshas Vayakel, when it talks about do not do malacha, so it says, Mechalalaha mos you. I'm sorry. Kala oisa by malacha yumas. Anyone who does malacha shall be put to death, if you're given warning and the like. In Kisisa, it says Mechalalaha mos yumas. So how come in Kisisa it uses the phrase mos yumas, and in Vayakel it uses the phrase yumas? And this is a general question. I mean, sometimes the Torah uses a double verbal form, mos yumas, which English tends to translate it as surely. He shall surely be put to death. But why does it sometimes say that and sometimes just yumas, right? So, again, well, I'll have to leave it over for tomorrow, but tomorrow we'll look at the idea that he wants to use his yesod to be masber the chiluk between mos yumas, pre-cheder ego, and yumas after cheder ego. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.